Hello and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I am Joe Devine and today I was delighted to be joined by Amy Lawrence, the writer of 89. There it is. If you're watching the video, you'll be able to see that lofted aloft in front of the camera. Arsenal's greatest moment, told in our own words, is the quote from Tony Adams on the front page. There's also a foreword from Thierry Henry in my version, the hardback, which is delightful. This book, I've been reading it over the last couple of weeks. I also watched the documentary film, which was released, I think, a couple of years ago, 1 or 2 years ago, produced by Amy. And of course, as many of you will know, it tells the story of Arsenal, triumphant Arsenal beating Liverpool on the final day of the league season, Division 1 in 1989. The extraordinarily unlikely circumstances which led to this game. Arsenal was second in the league, Liverpool were first. It was essentially winner takes all, and they played each other on the last day of the season, which is, as you would imagine, you will agree, extraordinarily unlikely that will ever happen again. One of the other aspects which contributes to that also is that a few weeks before this happened, English football suffered, its greatest ever tragedy, which was, of course, the Hillsborough tragedy, which the consequence of which was to delay the game. So not only were Arsenal playing Liverpool at Anfield on the last day of the season, they were also playing each other 2 weeks after the season had finished, and no other teams were playing at the same time. So it was, as I said, an extraordinary set of circumstances, and the story is told in the words of the players and the people that were there. It's very much little bite-sized chunks, little stories, I suppose, a lot from the players, including Tony Adams, Paul Merson, and there's parts from Mark Leach, the sports photographer who's been on the podcast before, who was there shooting the game, some bits from Amy herself. It's a really fascinating read, and it is sufficiently different from the documentary. If you've seen that and you're interested to read the book, you should do. I think it's described by Amy as a lot of stuff that had obviously not been able to fit into the 90-minute film, but was really worthwhile finding some way of releasing it. And essentially, this is that. So yeah, I spoke to Amy for about an hour. We talked mainly about 1989, what it was like back then. Goodness me, I wasn't even alive, so I had a lot of questions, as you could imagine. We talked about George Graham. We talked about George Graham's tactics of the time. That was particularly interesting for that specific game. We talked about the players, and towards the end of the podcast, I took 2 or 3, I think, questions from listeners about current Arsenal as well. So we talk about Granit Xhaka, him being jeered off the pitch the other night. We also talk about Unai Emery a little bit as well. So stick around towards the end and you can get the more up-to-date conversation. But I genuinely enjoyed having Amy in. It was really quite a lot of fun, and understandably quite somber in places as well. Discussion of Hillsborough is very difficult, and I greatly admire the way in which Amy has gone about doing that with not just the book but the film too. Who incidentally now is a writer who works for The Athletic, which is handy. So I can say that if you would like to access The Athletic, goodness me, how do I say this? I say this every week, and somehow I manage to forget. The Athletic. www.theathletic.co.uk/Tifo. Sorry. But it's really worthwhile. So do visit www.theathletic.co.uk/Tifo. Get a 50% off your annual subscription, and you can get a 30-day free trial as well to give it a try and see whether or not you like it enough to pay for it, which I'm convinced that you will. That's enough from me, and I hope you enjoy today's episode. Thank you for listening. Amy, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. First, I realise I just said this to you off air, but I was born in 1990 and I'm not an Arsenal supporter. I was aware of the result of the game, but before I watched the film and read the book, I don't think I was really aware of the significance of it, including all of the aspects, the fact that it was the two teams who could have won the league at the last day. I think I knew that, but when you have thoughts in your head that you don't contextualize for years, and then when you do, you go, oh, right, yeah, of course, that makes sense. Also, the impact only a few weeks beforehand of Hillsborough as well, which obviously proliferates throughout the book and throughout the film, which is very, well, I suppose, massively increases the emotion of the day. But for people like me and for some of our listeners who are younger or who don't associate this with the significance, which I suppose we should be giving it, can you just explain why it was such a big deal?
Yeah, and actually it's funny that you put it that way, because it makes me appreciate and understand and maybe have an excuse for why I've been so obsessed by this match for 30 years. Because in a way, you hold on to, whether it's a football memory or a life memory or something that might have happened to you and felt important at a point in your life. But, I've always said this would be my mastermind topic. It's the thing, it's the game, it's the moment, it's the goal that has been closest to my heart ever since it happened. And I got that feeling as well from the people that I spoke to in the making of the film and the book. Obviously the players, George Graham, the manager, and lots of other people that were involved in the day, whether it's someone who was more neutral like the referee, or people who were working in TV at the time, or were involved somehow on that night. It's something that has stayed as a memory, very, very intact, very crystal clear and very meaningful. So that explains in a way why, more than countless other sort of great comebacks or dramatic moments or things that happen in sport that have gone down in the history books, this one has a particular resonance that has lasted many, many years. The fact that it needs revisiting is partly one of the things I love about it, is it feels very much of its moment. And because football went through this great change very soon afterwards, it also feels like almost a signpost for, first of all, what football used to be like in the sort of pre-Premier League rebrand, international globalization of football, people being from all over the world in terms of every area, ownership, players, managers, supporters, this big beast that football has become. 1989 and events that happened around then are really like the last milestone of old football before everything starts to change. So from a historical point of view, quite apart from the fact that it was an amazingly dramatic and significant moment that's just worthy of recall, also it has, I think, a historical significance. And I think it's valuable and important to remember how old football was and what has changed. And that gives that layer of context.
Can I take a quick tangent and ask you what has changed? Because again, I didn't exist then.
Right.
The football I've known.
Feeling quite old now.
The first game I really remember was Manchester United winning the treble in 1999. I think I'd watched games beforehand, but
which
that's
was
the first
10
one that
years to the day, in fact.
Was it really? Okay, there you go. That's the first game I really remember. So I feel like I've only really known football as it is now. What was different?
God, it feels like everything. So financially, obviously, there was a huge difference. So whether you were a footballer or whether you were going to football, it was so much more readily available to anyone. So in 1989, I, as a fan who went a lot, could basically wake up that morning, decide I was going to go to the game, rock up with, I don't know, maybe £3 or £4, give that money to a bloke on the turnstile and walk in and go and stand where I like.
In fact, watching the film and reading the book, the thing that first came to my mind was you talk about going. Obviously, you went to Anfield for the game.
Yes,
but you're just going. It's no. It doesn't. Obviously, it's a big deal because of the occasion, but there's no discussion of how you got the ticket, how difficult it was, how you managed to be in this select group. I think I'm not sure if this is in the book, but you mentioned somewhere that your parents didn't know you were going, or your brother covered for you.
Yeah, that's right.
So I love the idea that you, as you said, it's accessible. Well, this is the other thing that's
phenomenally different about the entire experience, that, you can't imagine doing something important nowadays and not having a record of it or your experience of it through the lens of a camera or your phone. And I kind of find it amazing that this important event happened. I don't have a single photograph from that night. I never took a camera. We didn't have phones. If you needed to communicate with anybody, you had to find a payphone and have some change. And actually, in a way, that did me a massive favour, because if I'd have been contactable, I probably couldn't go, because I had my A-levels coming up, in the week or so that followed the end of the season. And I only really got away with it. My parents were overseas, and I concocted this ridiculous story because I knew it wasn't realistic to say that I wasn't going to be watching the game. So went to a friend's house who was also a football fan. We were going to revise together and then watch the game at their house, and I would stay over because I had to kind of give this impression to my folks that I was going to be not travelling to Anfield because so close to my A-levels. Goodness knows you couldn't be doing anything like that. And it worked because there were no mobile phones. I if you couldn't get hold of someone, you couldn't get hold of someone. So the way you lived and all your memories was all defined. If you wanted to meet up with someone, you had to make a plan via mail, or writing a letter or a note or landline, or
knocking on the door.
Or knocking on the door. Exactly, it was simpler times. And I think just from the point of view of how we experienced our football then, everybody just sort of wandered about doing stuff, but you didn't have to plan it 2 months in advance. You didn't have to as a 17-year-old as I was then, I didn't need a credit card to book a ticket for a match 2 months in advance and be a member and all this kind of malarkey. You just sort of wandered about watching football if you're a football fan. And the other thing about it is that in terms of fandom overall, football fans were not regarded in a very good light, let's say, and socially, if you like football, you were looked down on by a lot of people. Hooliganism was at its height in the 70s and the 80s. Fans were treated like crap. If you travelled around, the police thought you were an enemy. It was pretty not uncommon to get a clunk of a truncheon. If you were just doing nothing.
Did you get clunked with truncheons?
I wouldn't say I got clunked with a truncheon, but I did get carried off the North Bank by 4 police people, one on each arm and one on each leg on the final day of the North Bank. I was only just in a sit-in.
What did you do?
Nothing. I just didn't want to go home. It was the end of the North Bank, which was my sacred place at the time, and they didn't really give people a lot of time to say their goodbyes. They sort of wanted everybody. They wanted to clear it. And I don't know, a few hundred people sat around and just didn't want to go. And in the end, they obviously got fed up with us all and said, right, everyone's got to go home now. And I was like, no, I'm not going. And they were like, yes, you are. Physically manhandled out the ground. But on another level, I remember going to Elland Road around that time. They had this big moat. There was the away section, and then there was this moat, and then the fence. And I ended up, gosh, this is embarrassing, clambering up on this fence somehow after a goal, and I realised I couldn't get back because of this moat. And I think that was one of those occasions where, because I wasn't a bloke, I got away with it.
Right.
And some member of the West Yorkshire Constabulary, came and got hold of me and got me down and said, "You're bloody lucky you are," and shoved me back in.
Right. Well, also, I mean, I'd hate to repaint history that I don't know, but the assumption I always have had was that women didn't go to football games. I mean,
of course we did.
How many of you were there?
It was less than nowadays. Kind of stereotype of sort of 18 to 30-year-old shaven-headed blokes with tattoos was, not a completely fair reflection of the truth, but certainly age-wise, there was that made up a lot of a probably greater percentage of, crowds have got older.
Yeah.
Partly because tickets have got more expensive, and as a teenager, if you wanted to, you could pretty much go and watch your team play all around the country for not much more than your pocket money. Now, that's not applicable to most kids today. So I think generally it's an older environment around modern day football, and obviously it's infinitely more diverse in terms of not just types of people, but where people come from. The football tourism aspect, which was much less something that you saw in those days. It wasn't never. There was always big sort of Scandinavian supporters clubs that came over or what have you, but you didn't get the international fan bases or the, you know, holiday makers that take in a game because it's something that you would do if you were traveling. So all that kind of vibe was very different. And the other, of course, majorly significant thing was we had terraces. And of course, that was for a lot of people, an attraction of the football experience. There was something very visceral about being part of this swaying, moving crowd. It was a very physical experience.
Is it physically more of a collective, I suppose?
Oh my goodness! And I have to say that I mostly loved it. I mean, it's complex to articulate things like that now because of what happened at Hillsborough and how things had to change. But there were, you know, when a goal was scored, if you were on a terrace, more often than not, you went kind of flying. You know, the whole mass of the crowd moved. You could find yourself 20 yards away from where you started. Yeah. And it was sort of amazing. Yeah. I mean, it was a big adrenaline rush. Obviously, there were times when it was dangerous and in the worst possible imaginable way. That was the case at Hillsborough. But most people who went to football those days and stood on terraces will have memories of it being a level of uncomfortable where it was a bit scary. Yeah. And I pretty much always made a point of having a crash barrier behind me. Right. So I could go that way. Yeah. But if you had one in front of you and then suddenly a load of people are coming down on you, it's terribly frightening. So I'm just painting a picture of what it was like going to football. That's just, we've talked for God knows how long just about fans. But obviously TV, so another big change from today. And when sometimes I can't believe, it's made fans much more knowledgeable because you can watch football or footballers or highlights from pretty much anywhere in the world. But back then, if a player arrived and you signed someone, you might well not have ever seen them play before or paid much attention to them, because if you signed someone from, let's say, Sheffield Wednesday or Stoke, as Arsenal did in that team in 1989, you might not have been that bothered about noticing who the right back was, or if you'd even played against Stoke, who were in a different division to you that often. And you couldn't go on YouTube and find a highlights video because there was no YouTube and there were no highlights videos. And even if you think about how clubs operated, you know, if you had a scout, the scout would go and watch the team that you were about to play in a week or so, or they'd go and watch a player who the manager was maybe interested in. But these dossiers of knowledge and the ability to tactically analyse minutiae and all the data that is part of modern football didn't exist. Yeah. So even the way that managers managed or coached, or the way that players were with each other, if a player turned up at a new club as well, they felt they had to sort of prove themselves, because more often than not, these guys didn't know each other. But what they did have was shared language and shared cultural references. So if your dressing room is pretty much exclusively British, which they almost all were in 1989, you can imagine that the vibes within the camp are completely different to what we would see in today's world. And another thing that it's a little part of the things I found interesting about working on the film and the book was the little details that people remembered that really kind of symbolise how much things have changed. So, for example, on the team coach, you might find two defenders, Tony Adams and Lee Dixon, talking about the winger that they're playing against. And you know what? If he's coming down my side, I need you 5 yards closer to me. I mean, presumably all this is now happening with videos and all the
little files.
But they would have that conversation person to person on the coach because nobody had headphones. Nobody sat, or if you were talking about generating a team spirit, there'd be a card school on the bus. So the guys that want to play cards would sit in a four or whatever and gamble their whatever fivers or whatever it might be and play cards the whole way up from London to Manchester or what have you. That. And so even if you think about how a team spirit develops,
that's the way they communicate with each other. The bonds that they had were completely different to a modern dressing room.
Yeah.
And even when they would, training was, there was nowhere near as much time spent at a training ground for a player compared to today. The idea that you come, you train, you go to the gym, you have a massage, you maybe have a yoga session or go to see the psychologist.
Sleep in one of the pods.
Or whatever it might be. And eat. I mean, obviously the food was, steak and chip stuff, egg and chips. It wasn't kind of chicken and pasta and broccoli or whatever.
Athletically, was there a huge difference then, do you think? I mean,
obviously the drinking culture still very much existed. And if you think about how players would go and socialise, there would be particular days of the week. I mean, the Tuesday Club in Arsenal's case was the way they did it, because they would usually have a day off on Wednesday. So they'd come in on Tuesday, do a bit of training at Highbury, get in the stadium, and then, they'd come in with their gear to go straight out from training.
Is that the reason for the name of Alan Davies' podcast?
It is indeed. It stems from the
I thought it was just because
social activity of the times.
Right.
Not at all.
So George Graham then. How long was this team in situ before they won the league that year? I mean, how many of its kind of main functioning parts were there? Because the film paints a picture that many of them were kind of brought in the 1 or 2 years beforehand by Graham himself. Is that accurate?
Well, George Graham arrived in 1986, and in the couple of years prior to the 88-89 season began this process of regenerating. And his whole philosophy was quite interesting. He started off as a youth coach. Terry Venables had invited him to Crystal Palace when he was manager there and given him the youth team as his first experience of coaching. And what he noticed working with the young players is they listened to him and did everything that they were told.
It's as simple as that.
Walking into a dressing room with much more established players, there was some of the guys like Charlie Nicholas and Kenny Sansom and Tony Woodcock, and these were internationals. They were stars of their day, and I think then they were a bit complacent and they didn't really want to be moulded that much. And George thought, why can't I do what I did with the youth team, which was absolutely create something and mold it myself. If I want to do that, I need players who are going to listen to everything I've got to say and they're going to do it and they're going to learn and they're going to work. And the players who are going to do that are young or hungry as hell because they're playing in lower divisions or smaller clubs and this is their big chance. So he deliberately targeted players that he liked, and it was like a kind of jigsaw puzzle of putting together the ones that he was willing to work with who were already there. The youth team, he was blessed that he arrived and there was a phenomenal generation. Manchester United's class of 92 is obviously hugely famous, but Arsenal had their own class of a few years previous, where when you think of the names that came through, Tony Adams, who was possibly the best defender the club have ever had, David Rocastle, Michael Thomas, two unbelievably gifted young London midfield players, Paul Merson, who was a super skilled player of his time, who was a maverick, but he had touches of genius in his boots. I'm probably missing a few. My brain's not working properly. It's been a long night last night. Apologies. But there was a sort of core of 5 or 6 young players who were seriously talented and had the right mental attitude. So bringing those guys through and giving them experience, getting rid of the prima donnas, bringing in the likes of Lee Dixon and Steve Bold from Stoke City, Nigel Winterburn from Wimbledon, Brian Marwood from Sheffield Wednesday, Alan Smith from Leicester. Most of these guys came either in the summer of '88, the beginning of the season, or perhaps the season before.
Right.
So it was
very recently assembled.
He put it together quite quickly, really.
And were those players that came, like Lee Dixon as an example, was he considered at the time to be sort of a workhorse, really, presumably, if he was in and around all of this?
The Lee Dixon story is just another perfect example of the kind of wonders of how things have changed. So George Graham's great scouting method was to get the local newspapers
from all the regions. And in those days, local newspapers were the absolute place where you got your knowledge, you know. And each local newspaper would have their own reporter that covered their patch, who would usually be pretty pally with their manager. And George used to get all these papers, and he would get his secretary to cut the journalist's kind of column out every Monday morning, and they would chuck the rest of the newspapers away. And he would read through them, and he noticed that Lee Dixon, young defender of Stoke City, had been player of the year twice in a row, and he was a fullback. And George thought, a fullback getting player of the year twice? He's got to be quite good. So he went to watch Lee Dixon. And while he was there, he thought, oh, I like the look of this big bruising centre half next to him, who was Steve Bold. And that was scouting. And he bought them both. And he put together what would become the iconic back four of not just that generation, but any generation, for less than £1 million.
Yeah.
Because Steve Bold, Lee Dixon and Nigel Winterburn cost less than £1 million between them. And Tony Adams was already there.
Yeah. It's pretty astonishing, really, isn't it? I mean, for last week's podcast, we had a guy called Nikos Overhaul in from Statsbomb, whose job it is to liaise with football clubs, including Premier League football clubs. And Statsbomb offer various analytical services, and scouting being one of the main ones. What he was talking us through in terms of how clubs and companies like Statsbomb now search for managers and players who may be undervalued, let's say, is it's incredibly complicated, and you know it's such an in-depth process. I love the idea that what are we now? 30 years ago, crikey, okay. 30 years ago.
Afraid so.
It was as simple as that. I mean, that sounds kind of lucky in a way, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, no, because if you, as a manager, if you didn't bother to do that.
No, but just seeing Steve Bold there at the time, you weren't there to see him, but then.
Because otherwise, how are you going to see him?
Yeah.
Because nobody's videoing stuff.
Yeah.
Or making, highlights reels. Just didn't exist.
Yeah. Quick reminder that this episode of the Tifo Football Podcast is supported by The Athletic, the best place to read about football online. And if you're enjoying listening to Amy Lawrence talking about football with me on today's podcast, you really should sign up to The Athletic, because Amy is one of their hosts of incredibly talented and rich-veined writers. Now, what does rich-veined mean? That's what you're asking. I'm not really sure, but I think if I were to try and describe it myself, I would say that it means excellently educated, very insightful, very good journalism-y, and good at really cutting to the heart of the matter, you know what I'm saying? And providing excellent editorial writing, which is precisely what The Athletic does. So rich-veined indeed was the correct choice of words. And I won't be redoing this bit because I said the right thing. That's totally accurate. But yes, Amy, there's David Ornstein, there is, Michael Bailey, if you like Norwich, there's him. There is Phil Hay, if you like the Northeast, and other things too. Goodness gracious me, there's too many to name, but you can get a 30-day free trial to go and look for yourself. So if you are a supporter of a club which you feel does not have requisite coverage beyond your local media, and you want to learn a little bit more about your football club, get a 30-day free trial by visiting theathletic.co.uk/Tifo. Find out who your writer or writers are who write predominantly on your club. Find out about the level of access that they get. Find out about the exclusives. It really is the place to be if you support particularly a Premier League club at the moment. They have a handful of Championship clubs as well. But if you support a Premier League club, particularly a lesser well-supported club, for example, Norwich again. Michael Bailey worked at the Eastern Daily Press for a very long time. He has all his connections at the club. His first piece for The Athletic was a long interview with Delia Smith, for example. It's the perfect place to read about Norwich. And you can go and try it for 30 days. If you like it and you want to stay, you get 50% off an annual subscription, which works out to be about £2.50 per month. So it's totally affordable and it's very worthwhile. But that's not all. Can I ask you a little bit about the way that George Graham had the team play? Because one of the things that we do here at Tifo is we make videos about football tactics, and a big part of our audience is interested in that. What I found fascinating from reading the book and watching the film was the idea that the tactics on the final day were changed seemingly for the first time they played that formation, or that took that approach.
Not quite, but
not quite. Okay, well, I'm exaggerating a little bit. Print the myth. But would you talk to me about the context of that a little bit, because that seemed like it's a big deal even then, right?
Well, I mean, when you think about how much tactical analysis there is generally in football nowadays, I mean, it was that slight stereotypical old line about tactics, are they a little minty sweet, like Tic Tacs, because people really weren't that interested in tactics in those days. And there was definitely not that much variety as you might get nowadays, and so much thought put into specific approaches for specific games or specific players. I think most clubs would try and identify a way of playing for themselves, and that was sort of how they played, for better or for worse. And 4-4-2 was pretty standard back then, and that's certainly how Arsenal played. Or it would maybe be 4-4-1-1, because the kind of strike partnership thing, I mean, everybody had a strike partnership. The idea that you would play one up front or three or this or that. The only thing that might be interesting is whether is the dynamics of your strike partnerships. It tended to be one big guy and one little guy, somebody who could really hold the ball up well, and a kind of cleverer, maybe faster, inventive player who could play off the number 9, if you like. Number 9 and number 10 were sort of fairly standardized within. I mean, that's another thing. Even like shirt numbers.
Yeah.
Well, 1 to 11. Yeah. No messing.
Did they keep the same numbers every game? Because I know before, I'm not sure at what
you
point that stopped.
You tended to. But I mean, obviously there would be changes. In fact, in that game, Steve Bold, who was a centre back, played 10, which was shocking.
Okay.
Because,
was there a reason for that?
Yes, because Arsenal played 3 centre backs, which was very surprising. So they needed another number from somewhere, and it ended up being the 10. So 4-4-2 was the order of the day, and Arsenal played it and had it down to an art form for most of the season. It was incredibly effective. The back four, which was this iconic back four, this was their first season together, and it clicked pretty quickly and pretty well. In front of them, they had a midfield four. They had 2 terrific wide players, Brian Marwood, who they signed from Sheffield Wednesday, who was just very effective at driving up the wing, beating his man, and he had fantastic cross on him. David Rocastle on the other side, a bit more of a creative player, strong, had Brazilian-like-esque skills. Everybody loved Rocky. In the midfield, there would be 2 of Kevin Richardson, Michael Thomas, Paul Davis, who played a little bit less during that season after he punched Glenn Cockrell in the jaw, broke his jaw off the ball, and ended up with a trial by television, first time that was ever used.
Wow.
Days long before VAR, with a very long ban. And then up front, it was generally Alan Smith, who was the big number 9, with Paul Merson playing off him. Right. But George Graham, being a bit of a student of tactics, he used to read books from America about sports psychology and specialist things. He had a quite broad interest. He developed this thirst for knowledge about things like tactics and psychology and stuff that was quite a little bit ahead of his day, really. And he looked at Liverpool. Liverpool were the absolute gods of football in that era, the dominant team of the best part of 20 years, probably the best team in Europe, as well as, being regarded as almost unstoppable domestically. And they had just won the double in 1988 and had a wonderful team full of so much quality. And the danger that George Graham identified came from the flanks. So John Barnes and Ray Houghton were 2 absolutely stupendous players. Barnes in particular was just someone that people couldn't cope with in that day and age. And they had brilliant strikers, Ian Rush, John Aldridge, who were clinical. So his feeling was, we have to stop Barnes and Houghton getting the ball. Now, how are we going to do this? I'm going to put an extra centre-back in, 3 at the back. I'm going to push up my 2 full-backs, Lee Dixon and Nigel Winterburn. They are going to be right on top of Barnes and Houghton and try and keep them out of causing trouble. Keep them too far distant from
Liverpool centre forwards. They've got 2 centre forwards, and my 3 of Tony Adams, Steve Bold, and David O'Leary will take care of those strikers. So that was his vision of nullifying Liverpool. And because Liverpool and Arsenal were supposed to play originally earlier on in the season, it was actually scheduled to be the week after the Hillsborough disaster happened. George Graham had one practice run, which was away at Old Trafford, which was a little earlier in the season. And he thought that was an ideal type of game to try it out. And the players were a bit like, what are we doing this for? Like, we've been 4-4-2 all season and it works. Why change? So there was some scepticism, and he had to convince his players that they were doing it for a reason. But the relationship between the manager and the players was so strong then, they believed him so intensely that they just went along with what he said, even if they might have had their doubts.
It's a big gamble, isn't it?
Yeah, and the game at Old Trafford was a really crazy one. It was played in driving rain, and Arsenal went 1-0 up. Tony Adams, who was like the captain, fantastic, scored a goal. And then late on in the game, the ball came across, and Tony Adams went for it with his left foot, which is not his favoured foot. Tried to bit of a desperate clearance, and it was just these terrible conditions, like sleet rain in your face, and he sliced the ball and it just looped in the worst imaginable possible way over John Lukic, and he scored an own goal, which was one of the moments where the donkey jibes that were associated with him were in full flow. And the next morning's papers had Tony Adams with a pair of donkey ears, photoshopped rather crudely in 1989 style. So, even then there was no social media as such, but you could be vilified as a player and have a hard time and get reputations and get grief.
Even a game away from winning the league.
People used to throw carrots at him.
Yeah.
It's just mad. But anyway, I digress. The practice game ended 1-1, and George Graham went back to 4-4-2. And then when it was time for the final game of the season, first against second, essentially a winner takes all match for the title, sort of like the FA Cup final and the Premier League wrapped into one 90 minutes.
Except Arsenal had to score 2.
Yeah. There's a specific set of circumstances for the away team to win it. They've got to win away from home by 2 goals, and Liverpool are so brilliant that nobody imagines it's humanly possible that they're going to lose at home by 2 goals.
Yeah.
So it was a really specialist set of circumstances, and what made it more interesting was that 90 of the 92 professional clubs in England had finished all their matches. And this was the only one left. So literally the whole football nation stopped what they were doing on that Friday night, switched on their television screens. We only had 4 channels then anyway, and straight onto ITV. Brian Moore's commentary, away you go.
I mean, I know a lot of the players say this in the book and in the film. It could never happen again, that set of circumstances. I mean, it's unfathomable that it would
couldn't happen again. And the reason it couldn't happen again is because of Hillsborough.
Yeah.
And Hillsborough had obviously a very direct logistical influence on the fact that this game ended up being a kind of extra at the end of the season because of all the rescheduling that went on. But much more importantly, the emotional backdrop because of the Hillsborough disaster was really unlike anything I've ever seen in football. And it created an atmosphere around the day and around the night that in many ways makes it so much more meaningful than just a pure sporting event. And I'll always feel, it's difficult to find the right words, but very, very profound sadness and regret about any reminder of the Hillsborough tragedy. In some ways, I don't know, I feel very, there's a kind of personal attachment, I think, that any football fan from the time feels. It touched everyone, and in a way, nobody knew what to do or how to say, how to express themselves. It was really difficult. You didn't even know if you felt like football should carry on anymore. And somewhere in your mind, you wondered whether it was right that Liverpool would win the league.
Yeah.
So it was complicated emotionally because, of course, you're 17 years old and the last time your team won the league was the year you were born, and here you are, and of course you want your team to win the league, but you just don't know if it's right. So it was quite difficult to understand it all.
I mean, there's a exceptionally moving excerpt in the centre of the book. I can't remember the name of the author.
Laura Lawrence. No relation.
Would you briefly talk us through that?
Yeah, I would.
It's obviously...
It blew my mind when I first read it. It's Laura is a Sheffield Wednesday fan, and she wrote a blog a few years ago about her personal memories of that day. And her family home was very close to the Hillsborough Stadium, and she depicts in a very childlike way exactly what she saw. And obviously what she didn't see was what happened inside the ground. Yeah. But what she did see was fans turning up before the game, and she describes the atmosphere very vividly. And then she describes the mood in her house with her family, obviously watching what was going on the telly and finding out the news bulletins that just got worse and worse and worse. And then she describes people coming, particularly Liverpool supporters coming back to their cars or their minivans or trying to get back, and how their parents opened the door of their house and literally grabbed people off the street and made them come in and phone their families. Mm-hmm. And even the kind of big dial tone telephone that was wired to the wall, because of course, it was just not easy to contact anybody instantly in those days. So you were reliant on something like that. And, them bringing people into the house and giving them a cup of tea or holding them or, making them phone their families and just giving them a space of refuge.
Yeah.
On what must have been the most unimaginably difficult circumstance.
Yeah.
Just is profoundly moving personal side of the story.
I think it was the perspective for me as well. I think you said at the beginning, obviously it's written in a quite a childlike way, from the perspective of a child who is not totally, I think, what's the right way of putting this? I think it's a kind of, has a unique perspective. Often children see things in a totally different way to how adults do. And I think, the way in which it is written from that perspective, the descriptions of the people that are there in the house, the descriptions of her parents, the way that her parents kind of panic and sadness impact her. It's it's intensely moving in the middle.
I mean, it was the biggest challenge we faced really in all of this.
Yeah.
Which was how to depict what happened in the most sensitive way possible. Because essentially the majority of the story being told from an Arsenal perspective is a story of something uplifting and triumphant and memorable. And yet you have the intertwined kind of inextricable kind of relationship that the moment has with the worst episode in English football history. So yeah, it was, I felt that it was more helpful maybe to look at it from the outside looking in, rather than trying to be a Hillsborough book or a film and be it needs far too much depth, and there are people who have made films and written books about Hillsborough that are absolutely vital and important, and need to be seen and read again and again and again. But it was trying to make sure that we covered what was important, but without feeling obligated to try and turn this book or this film into a Hillsborough book or film, which we couldn't do.
But I think it's done really well. And also, I remember another very moving aspect of it. I think it was Lee Dixon who talks about handing the flowers over to the fans at the beginning of the game, and the moment that he lets go of the flowers, how it hits him, and he describes a sort of a mixture of emotions. Really, he's really G'd up for the game, and he finally realizes the significance of the game he's about to play. But at the same time, there's this overwhelmingly emotional aspect to handing off the flowers, and I think seeing it through the eyes of the players is very important, because presumably it must have had a huge impact on them going to play there as the final game as well. I mean, they weren't immune to it, of course.
Of course, and I think that it's a really interesting thing to have talked to them about it, because now that they're adults, you can look at it through a slightly different prism.
Yeah.
But they were most of them like in their early 20s at that time, and not that experienced in life, of like very difficult life moments, and very much living in the football bubble, which is normal within football, and probably necessary, that you have to just go in and work. It's their job to try and get ready to win football matches. And I think that a lot of them found it too difficult to try and think about it too much, in a way. And it's something that they sort of wrestle with later on, but acknowledge that at the time they felt that all they could do was be guided by the authorities. Let someone tell me what to do. As players, they just wanted someone else to tell them how they should act, because it was almost too overwhelming for them to try and figure out independently what to do.
It's the kind of natural way to respond to a situation like that, I suppose, isn't it? It's to almost kind of
But the handing over the flowers was very symbolic and helpful, I think, because everybody felt they had to pay the best respects they could, but somehow be focused on doing their job.
Yeah.
And it was quite a hard mix, I think. And helpful that they had some sort of mechanism on the night to do that.
Yeah. Well, can I say to you that I think it's lovely. I really like the book. I love the film as well. And I think what I like about it so much is, I suppose, the way in which it is told. It seems like a very pure vision of football, which is told through different people's stories, and I spoke to a couple of people about it when I was doing some preparation for the podcast. My girlfriend's dad is a big Arsenal fan. He remembers the game, and I was talking to him about his stories of it. Even my girlfriend, who's really not into football, I think she was 5 or 6 at the time, she remembers the day because she remembered this lovely plastic chair that she'd been given from the Irish Centre in Harlow, Essex. And when Michael Thomas scored the goal, her dad threw it at the ceiling and it broke. She was furious, but she's always associated that with the game. And I spoke to Mark Leach as well, who I think who features in the book. He's a friend of my dad's, and I was asking him about it. Obviously, he was there taking his photographs. But as I said, I would really encourage people to watch the film and read the book. I love the way that it is told as stories. I suppose that's really what football is, and it's easy to forget that now, because there is a kind of constant stream, as you said, of media, really, and you're up to date with what's happening at all times. Everyone's story seems to be kind of individual to themselves in their phone, but the way in which it's told, it's lovely. It really is lovely.
Thank you so much.
Would you mind if I ask you a couple of questions about Arsenal now, which might not be quite as lovely?
Won't be anywhere near as lovely, but shoot.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions from Tifo listeners. The first is from Essien. Why is Xhaka captain? Should he stay as captain, especially after what happened against Palace? What did happen against Palace, Amy?
Okay, so I think what happened against Palace was that Granit Xhaka and everything he represents to people and how he feels about things, everything just came to a head. I don't think this was an isolated moment. I think it was a long time in the making. I also think it's a situation where it actually was part of something bigger. It became a sort of vehicle for a lot of people to express a lot of frustrations generally. So while it was about that particular moment and that particular player, I also think it was actually about the manager, the team, the style of play, the ambition, a whole bunch of stuff that got crystallized in this almost opportunistic moment for an expression of emotion. On a very precise way, Arsenal had thrown away a 2-goal lead. Xhaka was substituted, and as he began to leave the field quite slowly,
Some people were aggrieved that the captain shouldn't be running off the pitch so that a replacement can come on and try and change the game. There was ironic jeers. It's not the first time this has happened. He had the same in Arsenal's home game against Aston Villa, where they were trying to come back from a difficult situation. And halfway across the pitch, it obviously got under his skin to the point where it pushed the final button, and he reacted, cupped his ear. He was seen to express himself in industrial language, took off, threw his captain's armband to the floor rather than actually giving it to the player who would then wear it, and ripped off his shirt and batted away Emery's attempt at a handshake and disappeared down the tunnel. In so doing, the ironic jeers turned into quite vociferous boos.
Yeah.
And it was really very ugly on the part of pretty much everyone. I felt at the time, as a kind of human emotional reaction, that Granit Xhaka let himself down, but so did a lot of the supporters, really. It was not a nice thing to witness from anyone. And why was he made captain in the first place? I think the clever move maybe would have been for Emery to make Aubameyang captain on the pitch and Xhaka club captain.
Right.
Because there's a lot of things that Granit Xhaka does off the pitch where he is the absolute perfect captain.
Right. He's
very much liked in the dressing room. He's got some authority. He's the guy who keeps people on their toes, who kind of sets the bar in terms of standards of behaviour, which maybe doesn't feel like a great thing to say after what happened on the pitch. But he's really highly regarded as being captaincy material in all those areas. He always fronts up. He'll do his talking, and he tries to stay positive and set a good example. Aubameyang is a much cleaner choice to be your on-the-field captain, because part of the problem is that there are people who argue that Xhaka shouldn't be an automatic pick, and you do get into difficult territory if your captain is not an automatic pick.
Yeah.
Because of the aspects of his game that make him vulnerable. Individual errors that quite often cost goals, switching off, lapses of concentration, lack of mobility, recklessness. That's all part of his game, as well as being a good passer, a good technician, and the things that he does well. He's a mixed bag player, and that makes it difficult, particularly because midfield is Arsenal's massive problem area. And it feels like the team is dysfunctional because the midfield is dysfunctional, and frankly, the midfield has been dysfunctional for pretty much the whole season. He can't get the balance right. Doesn't matter who he picks, doesn't matter what formation he picks. The manager cannot get a functional midfield yet. So it feels like that heart of the team and that heartbeat of the team, being the captain, is an easy target to be a lightning rod and be a problem area.
Okay.
So,
great. The next question is from Sir Sage. It seems as if the Unai Emery experiment has failed and should be ending soon. Who would come in as a genuine improvement from the current coach? Do you agree with that, firstly? And if so, even if you don't, a little hypothetical, your preference for the next coach would be interesting to hear.
I think that what's complicated all perceptions of Unai Emery is that 18 months on, people seem as sort of bewildered as ever by what he's trying to achieve. And the fact that there is no discernible, the word identity has been used a lot, is very unhelpful. He's been backed. He's been given some quite expensive, fancy tools to play with. He's got a massive problem with Mesut Ozil, which doesn't help. I think that, that he lacks the sort of authority really over what he's doing, and the belief this is exactly what we're trying to do here. Nobody can figure it out. There's obviously a lot of tensions and pressures now within the dressing room. So when people ask the question like, should he be sacked? Sometimes it's helpful to flip a question like that on its head and say, if you're trying to look at the reasons why he should be sacked, what are the reasons that he should stay?
And it's really hard at the moment to present a compelling argument to say Unai Emery must stay because all these things are going well, because lots of things are not going well. The powers that be can't be making decisions based on what fans think. They have to do it on what they think.
Is that not how it works?
Well, funnily enough. And at the moment, the noises are that they remain happy with Emery, but it's quite difficult to see that they can sustain this kind of almost an acceptance of mediocrity and problems for too much longer without thinking, if it carries on, you throw the season.
Yeah.
Arsenal should, with the squad that they've got, be having a real good go at the top four and not relying on winning the Europa League.
Particularly with the context of the other teams performing poorly for obvious reasons. So.
Yes, exactly. So I think that it feels like it really needs to be quite a fluid situation.
Yeah.
And personally, I think it wouldn't be a bad time to be starting to think of someone else if you're not convinced as a board that this man is the man for a successful season. And so far, there's not enough evidence of that. There's not enough evidence of improvement, which after 18 months there should be.
Let's say you were in charge then. Who would you hire? Who's the dream? Well, I suppose dream and also realistic.
Exactly. I mean, you have to go for someone who's available, and that's the biggest problem, because if you have a kind of fantasy, money, no object situation, then maybe you go for someone that you think can culturally transform the club and can come in and take a team and give an imprint immediately and give a buzz immediately, and also yet have a kind of mid to long term strategy for taking the club back to where they want to be. And where they want to be, when you listen to the owners and the people who run the club, is challenging for the Premier League and Champions League.
Yeah.
They're obviously quite far away from that at the moment.
Yes.
So you have to be realistic and think who can come in now and do a better sort of interim job than Emery is doing. And I think when you look at available people now, if Allegri is available, it's kind of a madness not to be considering that, given his track record.
It's funny, isn't it? It feels like there are a few people available. I mean, Allegri is the name which is associated with every kind of top level job.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Mourinho is available, and that would be a very, very complex emotional thing to try and get your head around. I mean, here's the guy who talked about a specialist in failure turning up there. It's too weird for me.
Also based on recent performance issues.
But there are people who think that why not come in and try and get him organised. I'm not sure I quite ready to go down that path.
It would be funny for a while, as it always is.
Freddie Ljungberg is mentioned as a potential interim, but I think it would still be a pretty hard job for him.
Yeah, I think.
And if he was given that responsibility, I think that he needs to have someone come in and help him.
Yeah,
sort of mentor him.
Yeah. Okay. And the final question comes from Devine Sa. How does that Michael Thomas moment compare to any Premier League moment, particularly Aguero in 2012 or Leicester's surprise in 2016, also considering Arsenal's invincibles?
It's the best ever.
Yep. Okay.
Everybody is entitled to their own purely subjective view.
Well, it's difficult to argue against, though.
Using those examples for comparisons, and the closest comparison is Man City and the Aguero title, but the obvious difference is that was not a situation where it was first against second, winner takes all. QPR were relegated.
Yes.
So for all the drama of the late theatre of the moment and the turnaround, which makes it the most dramatic Premier League finish there ever has been. If you're talking about the most dramatic football finish there's ever been in English football, there is no contest between Aguero and Michael Thomas.
And also, I mean, the fun thing about the Aguero moment is that you have, I mean, the footage is very memorable. I think Phil Jones is the main Man United player who's still on the pitch, kind of looking around, waiting for the result of the other game. That's very interesting. But Leicester City
was, I mean, it
was expected for a few weeks beforehand.
It lacked that sense of drama, and again, that kind of head-to-head sense of it. But obviously, as a fairy story, that's the best fairy story there's ever been.
Yeah.
So they're just different. But if you're talking about the most dramatic finish ever in the history of the Football League, to quote Brian Moore, then that's it. There's nothing.
It's very hard to argue
I don't even think there's competition.
Amy, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Cheers.
Oh, also, buy the book. Sorry, I should have done that ages ago. Look, I've got it here. It's fantastic. 89, you can purchase it from all the bookshops that are available. And also, you buy Invincibles as well, because that's really good, just a bit older. There you go. Right, cool. Thank you so much. And we'll see you again soon.
Cheers.